Happy Friday, everybody! So I decided, let me try to do something a little different right here. Something that will catch people's eyes. So I decided, why not come on here and give some of my unpopular sports opinions? And this is going to be about all different sports. You know, pro, college, North America specifically. So if there's anyone who's fans of international soccer, sorry, but I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm going to mainly stick with North American professional sports and a little bit of college, maybe. But that's what I'm probably going to stick with. And one other thing, too, before I get started. There's going to be several times where you're going to hear the word overrated used in this. And let me clarify when I say overrated. Overrated means that they're not as great or they're considered greater than they really were, whether that be a team or an individual. Sometimes you could have some good teams or good players, fighters, whatever the case may be, that were overrated. That doesn't mean they were bad. It just means they're not as great as some consider them. So keep that in mind because you're going to hear that at least once on this one. So I want people to understand what I mean when I say overrated. So with that being said, let's dive into it. So the first one. The Atlanta Falcons were right to trade Brett Favre, and here's why. Because if you think about the situation, Brett Favre was drafted by the Falcons. I think he only played a couple regular season snaps his rookie year at most. He didn't have any starts. I mean, if you look at the situation he was in, he didn't fit in with the Atlanta Falcons. And plus, if you look at the coaching staff they had at the time, was that really the right coaching staff that was going to groom Brett Favre to be a star quarterback? If you ask me, no. So I think, personally, with the Atlanta Falcons, they were right to trade him because considering what Brett Favre became, the common belief is to think, oh, the Falcons were stupid for getting rid of him. How could they let a future Hall of Famer go? Well, when you look at the situation at the time, you can understand why. Do you think Brett Favre and Atlanta really were a fit if you think about it? No, so that's strike one right there. Strike two, like I said, he didn't really have that good coaching staff there. And then when you look at what happened when Favre got to Green Bay, having Mike Holmgren and Andy Reid in his ear really was a contributing factor as well to his success. He didn't have that there in Atlanta. So I think, honestly, if they would have given him the keys as a starter in Atlanta, he probably would have had a similar career to a Geno Smith or a Rich Gannon where he blossomed with his first good year late. What I'm thinking is he probably would have been in Atlanta an extra year or two, not really done anything, then got traded or released and signed with someone else as their backup, maybe bounced around a couple teams as a backup, then maybe like late 20s, early 30s would have finally got a starting gig somewhere, would have had a good season out of nowhere, similar to what Geno Smith did this year, or what happened years ago with Rich Gannon when he had his first good season out of nowhere, which, yeah, Brett Favre could have had a little bit of a good run later in his career, I think, if he started in Atlanta, but he wouldn't have had those 3 straight MVPs he had with the Packers. He wouldn't have had those 2 back-to-back Super Bowl appearances. And who knows where his landing spot would have been if he all of a sudden blossomed late. That could completely change Brett Favre's career, and you might not I don't think he'd be in the Hall of Fame if it happened that way. Sure, he could have made a couple Pro Bowls, maybe a couple playoff runs late in his career, but the main thing that helped him get in the Hall of Fame was those mid to late 90s years with the Packers, especially those 3 straight regular season MVPs, those 2 Super Bowl appearances, that win the Packers had against the Patriots in, what was it, Super Bowl 31? But he doesn't have that if he stays in Atlanta. So I think actually the best thing that happened for Brett Favre was that he got traded from the Falcons to the Packers. And here's another point I want to bring up. A lot of people say, well, if they kept Brett Favre, they could have Brett and Dion. What makes you think Dion would have stayed? Ultimately, he wanted to go chase some championships. Which he ends up doing with the 49ers and the Cowboys. So you really think, with what I just said about Favre, what most likely would have happened if he stayed? You think Dion would have stayed for that? No, he would have bounced anyway. So I don't think it was a big mistake for the Falcons. I think they were kind of stuck in a lose-lose situation anyway. So now, here's my second one. Now, if you got any boxing fans here, this is going to catch you a bit by surprise, but Mike Tyson was overrated. Yes, I'm saying that because, look, again, when I say overrated, like I said when I started, it doesn't mean that that person was bad or that team was bad or whatever the case may be. Because here's the thing, people talk about Mike Tyson like he's one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, like he's up there with Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, and those guys. Now, from a name perspective and a popularity perspective, he's up there with those guys, but as an all-around boxer, no, he's not up there with those guys. Because if you look closer at his career in the competition, okay, some of his biggest wins were Michael Spanks. I'll grant you that. Trevor Bervick, who, do you see Trevor? Hey, LT. Thanks for stopping by. Like I said, Trevor Bervick, was he ever a guy you really thought of in top tier heavyweight in a strong era? And if you look at, and remember Larry Holmes, well, yeah, he's got down his resume, but let's not forget, Larry Holmes was retired for a few years. They offered him a ton of money. They offered him a ton of money to come out of retirement, accept that fight with Tyson. So, yeah, it says that he's got to win over Larry Holmes, but you got to remember, though, Holmes had been retired. So, that's a factor right there. And then when he did step up in competition, like against the best of his time, like Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, you saw what happened, specifically with Evander Holyfield. He got frustrated. He wanted a way out, so he bid him on the ear to get himself disqualified to get out of there. So, yeah, one of the biggest draws of all time? Oh, absolutely. One of the top heavyweights of all time? Yes, but if you're asking amongst the true all-time greats, take the name and popularity aspect out, he's not on that level with the guys like the Alis, Marcianos, Joe Lewis's of the world. He's just, so yeah, Mike Tyson, big draw, polarizing figure, big money star. Good heavyweight? Yeah, absolutely. But is he truly one of the all-time great heavyweights? If you ask me, no. Because when he stepped up in competition, he struggled. If you look at a lot of the competition he won against, wasn't all that, wasn't, you could look at some of them and say there was asterisks there, like with Larry Holmes, there's the asterisk of Holmes being retired for a few years and being rusty. Look at some of the guys he won against. There's the asterisks of, it was a weaker era. So there's some asterisks there to some of his biggest wins too. But as Tyson never competed against guys like Riddick Bowe. He never competed against Tommy Morrison. Now, obviously, his prison stint had something to do with that too, because he missed 5 years there as well. But still, yeah, I do have to say he's overrated in the regards of he's not as great as some make him out to be. Moving along. This is going to be a more recent one, but if Patrick Mahomes would have been drafted by the Chicago Bears, he would have been developed poorly and he would not be the star he is now. Because look, he would have been drafted into a situation with John Fox. Then after that would have been Matt Nagy. Now, do I think he would have been better there than Trubisky? Yes, he would have, but I don't think he'd be the quarterback he is now if he had to deal with that right there. I mean, sure, maybe the Bears would have had a few playoff runs, but do you think they would have made it to a Super Bowl by now with Patrick Mahomes? And you think he'd be considered the best quarterback in the league currently if he was put in that situation? I don't think he would be. So I think the best thing for Mahomes was for Kansas City to trade up and to pick him. Perfect starting point was with Alex Smith, a starter. He could sit under Alex Smith for a year, learn from him, and to have Andy Reid as his head coach, because Andy Reid's got a great track record with quarterbacks. His work as a quarterback coach for the Packers with Brett Favre played a role in Brett Favre's development. He helped out with Donovan McNabb with the Eagles. And then you even see Alex Smith had some of his best seasons under Andy Reid. And now look where Patrick Mahomes is. So, not to say that the guys like Brett Favre, McNabb, Mahomes don't deserve credit. They do deserve credit. Absolutely. But I'm saying, a contributing factor is pretty much everywhere Andy Reid goes, most of the quarterbacks that played for him have panned out. So he also deserves credit for that as well. So the point being is it was certainly a better starting place for Patrick Mahomes. And you're going to start noticing a little trend here with some of my unpopular opinions about with me emphasizing starting plays. You're going to start to notice a trend as I go along with this right here. So you're probably, Patrick Mahomes, I think Chicago Bear, I think they would have been in a better position, I think, as a team, but I think Patrick Mahomes on the flip side would have been in a worse position. So how much better off would the Bears have really been with Patrick Mahomes, though? How much better would they have been if he was groomed under that system? I don't think they'd be like contenders like everyone says they would, because sometimes you got to consider with these situations. It's not just the quarterback itself. It's not just the talent itself. It's also the system in place too. Yes, some of these quarterbacks could still probably excel even in bad situations if they're that good. But if they're in a really bad situation, they can only excel to a certain degree. Like I think Mahomes, if the Bears, he could only excel to a certain degree in that system. He wouldn't be able to do it the way he's done in Kansas City with the guys like Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, now Juju Smith-Schuster, Kadarius Toney when he's healthy, Marquez Valdes-Scantling when he's in there, if I pronounce that right. So, so you got to also factor that in too when looking at it. Now, this is going to tie into another one. Aaron Rodgers, in terms of his greatness, in terms of him being as great as he was drafted in the perfect position. Yes, despite the fact that Brett Favre gave him the cold shoulder as a mentor, I think him dropping all the way to the Packers in terms of him getting to where he's at was the best thing that could have happened to him. Now, if he would have went to the 49ers, could he have had a good run there? Yes, I think he would have struggled early, but he would have caught on. But do I think he would have dominated the way he did if that was his starting point? I don't think he would be that dominant. And let's see. And with Tampa Bay, with Gruden, knowing how Gruden can be, fall in and out of love with quarterbacks figuratively, that I don't think Tampa Bay would have been the best starting point for him either. Cleveland would have been an awful starting point for any quarterback, especially the New Age Browns. So I think, honestly, that was the best starting point for him to sit there, go under Brett Favre, have that chip of being in Brett Favre's shadow under him. And I think that helped motivate him to play as well as he did and to dominate during his peak years. So I think that was great for Rodgers in terms of his individual success as a quarterback, to have being in Brett Favre's shadow, to have to start in his shadow as a chip on his shoulder to motivate him to go out there and play well. So I think, honestly, that was a great starting point right there. So this next one, it's going to be around the same time frame. This one we keep a little more brief. I think, because a lot of people seem to think if Eli would have been the starter for the Chargers, they could have won a Super Bowl because they think, they could have cruised through. And I understand where they're coming from. They could have cruised through the regular season with some of that talent there. Antonio Gates, LaDainian Tomlinson, some of that talent on defense in the mid to late 2000s. And then Eli would show his best come playoff time. But honestly, knowing the Chargers and how cursed they are, I don't think Eli would get a ring. Yeah, early on he would have had some playoff appearances, maybe one or two runs to a conference championship if he were the starter there with the Chargers with that team around him. But I don't think he'd get a ring. Knowing how jinxed and snake-bitten the Chargers are, I just don't see it happening. I just think the Giants with Tom Coughlin was the better starting point. I think Tom Coughlin was going to get more out of Eli than Norv Turner would have. I mean, sure, Eli would have had Schottenheimer as his starting coach, but knowing the Schottenheimer curse when it comes to winning championships, I think that would have still been a factor. And I just think there's too many jinx factors with the Chargers that would have stopped Eli from winning a ring. So because I know some people like to put that out there, so that's why I have it as unpopular opinion. Now, this is one that some people go back and forth on when it comes to sports, but people tend to lean more toward, oh, this doesn't count. And that's about, do injuries count as someone being a bust? Now, I see a lot of people like to say that they don't really count, but I do feel like they do count. So, yes, and even with injuries for guys like Greg Oden in the NBA, RG3 in the NFL, they do count. Some people may feel that's unfair, but it does, and here's why. Because when you get drafted, part of being able to be a star for your team is the ability to stay healthy and stay on the field, stay on the court, stay on the ice, whatever the case may be. For whatever sport it is, you got to be able to stay healthy and stay active to help the team. If you're only playing 5-6 games a year in the NFL, or only playing 45% of the games in the MLB, NHL, or NBA, then how much of a help are you really? You're not much of a help if you can't stay healthy. And considering that being healthy is an important aspect to being a star in team sports, yeah, I got to say that for guys like RG3 and Greg Oden, yeah, injuries do play a factor in being a bust. Some people say they don't count, but they do count. They do. Because if you're not there to deliver because you're constantly injured, then they wasted their pick ultimately. So, yeah, that means that pick was a bust then. Yes, so injuries do count as far as being a bust goes for that very simple reason right there. So, here's an interesting one. This is one that's current. So, there is a possibility I could jinx this one. But I'm going to take my chances on it anyway. Jimmy Butler is not the guy that's going to lead a championship team in the NBA. Now, I think he's a guy that, as the number 2 or 3 best player on a team, could win a championship. I think personally, Jimmy would have had a better shot at a ring with Embiid being the number 1 guy, him the number 2 guy. If, like, say, Embiid were to get traded to the Heat, he would become the number 1 guy, Butler would become the number 2 guy. I think that team would have a better chance of winning a championship. Or if he had stayed in Philly with the 76ers behind Embiid, I think they would have had a better chance. Now, like, to me, Jimmy Butler, he's one of the top players in the NBA. He's one of the top players in the East, but when it comes to him trying to lead a team to a championship, I just haven't seen him as that guy who can, as the number 1 guy on a team, get it done. I feel like he's better suited as that number 2 or 3 guy on a championship team. Because, like, you remember when he was leading with Chicago, they got swept by the Isaiah Thomas-led Celtics. Obviously, the recent Isaiah Thomas back in 2017. With the Timberwolves, when he was leading that team, they won 1 game against the Houston Rockets. And you could say, well, he hadn't come into his playoff form yet. And yes, that is true. He started to come into his playoff form more in Miami. But even so far, I haven't seen anything that indicates he's going to lead him to winning a championship. Especially now with the Western Conference being a strong conference and the Eastern Conference being the weaker conference. I don't see him being the face of a championship team anytime soon. I mean, that's just me right there. I think as a number 2 guy, it could happen, but it's just like, yeah, even though he is an all-star, I just don't see him being that guy right there. That's just my opinion right there. Now, obviously, you never know. That we could turn around next year, I could have jinxed it. Could turn around 2 years, I could have jinxed it. But as of right now, I don't see that. So I feel like Jimmy Butler, yeah, number 2 guy right there. So when we talk about the Cleveland Browns and all the botched draft picks they've made throughout the years, especially the current incarnation of the Cleveland Browns, one of the first things that comes to mind is they drafted Tim Couch over Donovan McNabb. And obviously, we can certainly understand why that's considered a flop. But at the same time, I feel like if they would have drafted McNabb, they would have ruined him. They would have. Because if McNabb was thrust into that starting situation with that coaching staff, with the Browns having nothing around him, he would have had his confidence shattered and he wouldn't have been the star player that he was going to 6 Pro Bowls. I mean, what? So they wouldn't have helped much with him. Now, as far as Tim Couch goes, if he would have gone to the Eagles, I think would have been better for Tim Couch, but a downgrade for the Eagles. Maybe Tim Couch could have played better under Andy Reid, but I think the Eagles would have been worse off as a team. I could have seen them at best maybe 6 to 8 win team. So they wouldn't have had the same level of success with Tim Couch as they had with McNabb. So once again, thank you, Cleveland Browns, for passing on McNabb and letting us get him. So thank you for that one. But I don't think McNabb would have fared a whole lot better in Cleveland. And here's another one. Now, this is going to, obviously amongst hardcore sports network members, this is going to be a popular stance. But amongst mainstream sports media and mainstream sports fans, this is an unpopular one. So that's why I'm going to put it out there. So here we go. WWE played a big role in the growth of the UFC. Now, obviously, UFC fanboys will hate hearing that. Obviously, a lot of mainstream MMA analysis, they're not going to want to admit it. But that's why I consider it an unpopular opinion. Obviously, on the network, it'll be popular opinion, but amongst mainstream, it's not. But here's why. We go back, UFC, it's really started to grow around like 05, 06-ish. And one of the things that was a contributing factor was season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter was aired on Spike TV on Monday nights at 11 p.m. And you guys remember what was on Spike TV from 9 to 11 on Monday nights during that time period? If you're thinking Monday Night Raw, you are correct. So that was a golden opportunity for the UFC to niche into that fan base, because that was around the time, 05, some of the fans that were fans during the boom period were starting to become disenfranchised with it, but they would just glance at wrestling or check it out occasionally out of habit. And now here they were, provided a professional sports alternative to it. So that played a role, and slowly over time, the UFC started to grow a little bit, and the WWE started to slowly decline from where they were even back 2 decades ago. So that played a role right there as well. And then by like 2006, 2007, UFC was starting to do some pretty solid numbers. And speaking of WWE helping UFC, former WWE star in the early 2000s who tried out for the NFL, who decided to give a try in MMA in 2007, Brock Lesnar was signed by the UFC. Now, I'm aware Brock Lesnar's returned eventually, but I'm talking in the time frame of the 2000s in the growth of the UFC here. And remember, Brock Lesnar signed with them he signed them late 07, had his first fight in early 2008, Super Bowl weekend, and he was a huge draw for them. So that also helped get more eyeballs on him. Because you remember, you look at the rise of the UFC through the 2000s, you had 05, 06, The Ultimate Fighter was the first step. Then they bring in Brock Lesnar. Then by the end of 2009, boom, UFC was a huge deal. It was being advertised on all the different networks. It was being talked about all over the place. And it hits boom during those 2009, 2011 years is when it was at its top. And signing Brock Lesnar to that contract was a big deal for them that helped them get more eyeballs. So, so for those reasons right there, I will say that yes, the WWE did play a big role in the growth of the UFC. So yes, so I'll put that on there for those reasons. Now, Hey, so I'll be back. Oh, I gotta go. I'll be right back. Give me 1 minute. Okay, so now I'm back right now. So yeah, so far right now I've been going through quite a bit right now. So I figured this would be a fun thing to do right here. And if some of you guys are just tuning in, you haven't done so, do me a favor, drop a like. Feel free to leave a comment in the chat if you're just coming into this right here. Yep, so I'm going over a bunch of unpopular sports opinions. Now, I've gotten most of the main ones out of the way, so if you're just coming in and you wanted to catch the main ones, you could go back or you could wait till I'm finished recording and watch it after the recording's done on, I guess you could say on replay, if that's what you want to call it. But yeah, I'm still got some more unpopular opinions I'm going to drop, so let me get into it. So I think this is the last major one I'm going to get into. The baseball steroid scandal was overplayed and if it unnecessarily hurt the image of the game. Yes, I'm going to say that. It did. And here is why. Hey, Jeff, good afternoon. Yeah, thanks for stopping by. I know you got a stream coming up just a little bit, your typical football Friday. But so I thank you for stopping by before that. And I don't know how long you're going to stay, but appreciate you can stay. I appreciate the fact that you came by and best of luck with your stream. But yeah, as I was saying, the baseball steroid scandal was a complete overreaction and did a lot to hurt the image of the MLB. Yeah, in an unnecessary way. I mean, because you guys remember, it was absolutely ridiculous. Let me start off with the fact that it was absolutely ridiculous. Okay. And the reason I consider it unpopular perspective because everyone was talking about it like it was the biggest thing out there. Talk about steroids in baseball. Oh, this guy right here, Bonds is juicing. A-Rod's juicing. Mark McGwire juicing. And everyone was just going on talking about it like it was the biggest story out there. People were talking about this like this was a State of the Nation Union address with controversial remarks by the president. That's what this was like. I mean, people prioritized steroids in baseball over the president, who at the time was I think it was Bill Clinton when McGuire's story came out. Then it was George W. Bush during the peak of the steroid scandal. But people were talking about this more than they were Clinton and W. Bush and, anyone else who was in politics at the time. A lot of them still are, especially in the Senate, but that's a whole nother subject. But people made a bigger deal about that than that. People were more worried about steroids in baseball than domestic violence. And since we're talking sports, specifically among sports figures, they were more worried about that than they were, say, Money Mayweather's domestic violence history or, a lot of the other off the field conduct that was going on with the NFL. Now, obviously, in more recent years, that's changed. People start to focus more on that now. But at the time, everyone was so worried about it. And because that was the popular thing to talk about, that's why I'm saying people overreacted to it and talked about it way, way, way too much. Was it really necessary? Was it really that big a deal? Yes, I get that it was performance-enhancing drugs. It was considered a form of cheating, but was it really worth making such a huge deal about? For the sports media, yes, it was. And we know why? Because they profited off of it. As the old saying goes, controversy creates cash. And that's the mindset that they took in the sports media toward it. That's the mindset they took, that controversy creates cash. Let's put this out there. Let's make some cash off of it and profit off it. And that's exactly what they did. So that was just, I feel like that was so it was completely unnecessary, I feel. And it did a lot to hurt the image of baseball because I feel like ever since that steroid scandal came through and they came so worried about cleaning up the PEDs in baseball, which, look, I get that they obviously, the people in the MLB were going to care about it, especially if they were disallowed. So I get that from their standpoint why they cared, but from the sports media standpoint, they made such a big deal of it. I feel like they tarnished the image of baseball, and I feel like a lot of people lost interest in it, in part due to the steroid scandals going on. Now, is it the only reason? No, of course not. Obviously, as the year, because baseball was huge in the early 20th century. Obviously, as you got to the later 20th century into the early 21st century, the faster sports became more popular. That played a role in baseball losing some of its mojo as far as being the popular thing as well. People started to prefer the faster sports. So I get that right there. That played a role too. But I also feel like, let's not forget, that steroid scandal that went on throughout the 2000s with the MLB stars played a significant role in its image starting to wane. So I feel like it was unnecessary. People overreacted to it, and it hurt the game's image to a certain degree that it still hasn't bounced back from. So and here's going to be an interesting one. I've thought about it before. And as a Sixers fan, I was kind of torn on this one. Because when it comes to Allen Iverson with the 76ers and why they never won a championship, there's two schools of thought. There's the school of thought that it was the Met front office. They did a horrible job putting management around him. And there's another school of thought that he didn't have the personnel. He didn't have the attitude to win a championship. He cared more for nightclubs and, he cared more for partying, and him missing practice played a role in it. I feel like personally, I'm from the perspective that it was a combination of both. So I do feel like Allen Iverson's personality did play a factor in them not winning a championship, because he seemed to worry too much about those all-nighters, and that caused him to miss some practices, caused him to get banned from several casinos in Atlantic City because of it. And I feel like, yes. And also remember too, with Iverson, he had beef with a lot of his head coaches too, including Larry Brown. It's one of those things though too, where if you're always getting into it with different coaches, you're the common denominator in it. That means you're part of the problem. If it's always you having these issues with these coaches, then you're part of the problem yourself. So I feel like Allen Iverson's lack of maturity did play a role. Now, the front office, did they do a poor job? with putting good talent there? Yeah, absolutely. But Allen Iverson's lack of maturity as a leader, let's not forget that did play a role. I know as Sixers fans, we don't really want to acknowledge that because he was one of our favorite players for what he did on the court. But we got to be honest about it. Yeah, his lack of maturity did play a role in that as well. So can't solely put the blame on the front office, more specifically Billy King. You can also put some of that blame on AI too. And here's my last one right here. We look back on it, we think all these teams like the Celtics and then who else? And the Timberwolves and the Bucks were foolish to pass on Kobe. But when you look back on it, it made sense that they passed on him because you got to remember at the time, people didn't think that Kobe Bryant was going to be in the same stratosphere as guys like Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, and those guys. That was not the perspective at the time. So nobody thought at the time he was going to be in that category, especially coming because he wasn't the highest on the scouts list right there. Some of those guys like Sharif Abdul-Rahim, Ray Allen, Allen Iverson, Steve Nash, some of those guys that had some college ball experience were higher on the scout list. So that played a factor too at the time. And plus, Kobe himself wanted to play for a big market team, and he mainly expressed interest in the Lakers. So if you look at it from a team's perspective, you got some of these other prospects that show more interest in playing for your organization than this high school phenom. You're ultimately going to go gravitate toward the players that have more interest in playing for your team. So it worked out. So ultimately, I don't blame them for passing on Kobe. A lot of people like to blame those teams, especially looking back on it, which I understand. You look back on paper, you think, wow, teams like the Bucks or teams like those Bucks, those Timberwolves, man, they were stupid for passing on Kobe. That's the common perspective and the understandable one looking back on it. But when you think about the situation, the way things were at the time, they were right to do that, especially being that he wasn't interested in some of those teams. Why would you waste it? Why would you draft someone that wasn't really interested in your team that showed interest elsewhere? Let that team have that player. So I don't blame some of the teams that passed on him looking back on it. And I know it's become popular to knock them for it, looking at what Kobe became, but you also got to factor in the situation some of those teams that passed were in going into that draft. So got to look at that too. So that's all I got right now for these unpopular opinions. I thought this was a fun thing to do. Come on here, give them my unpopular opinion, see what you guys think of it right there. Even if you didn't watch it live, but you watched it afterward, you can definitely leave comments in the comment section. If you want to add some opinions of your own, or if there's anything you want to disagree with and debate in the comments, you're more than welcome to. So that's all I have to say for now. So to everyone that tuned in, thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your Friday or your Saturday or Sunday, whatever day it is you're hearing these comments. And until next time, Nicky Stees signing off.